welcome all of you. Thank you for joining today. We have an exciting presentation on rapid response and eradication of Caulerpa in California, lessons learned. Our presenter today is Rachel Woodfield. She's a marine biologist with Merkel Associates in San Diego, California. She began her involvement in the field of invasive species studies when she found and reported the first known occurrence of the invasive seaweed Undaria pinnatifida in North America. I may have butchered that. I apologize if I did. Later, the same year, she identified the first and only known occurrences of Caulerpa taxifolia in the Western Hemisphere. Working with the Southern California Caulerpa Action Team, she managed the development and implementation of all aspects of the successful rapid response and eradication for that algae from the 2 infested sites. And with the discovery of a second non-native Caulerpa species in Newport Bay in 2021, she again is on the team attempting to eradicate it before it spreads throughout the bay and further offshore. Her other work involves long-term monitoring of plant and animal communities in restored coastal wetlands in Southern California. So with that, I'll let Rachel take over. Rachel, do you want to share your screen?
Well, thank you for coming. I'm Rachel. Also on the line is Dr. Robert Mooney. He's going to be available to answer questions at the end as well. He and I have worked from the beginning on both of our Caulerpa infestations, and he's very knowledgeable about the details of it. So I'm going to start with talking about Caulerpa taxifolia because that was the first Caulerpa that was on America's radar. Then I'll talk about the response to California when we found Caulerpa taxifolia, and then go over the discovery of Caulerpa prolifera later on in California. It's now recognized that it's important for people who work on invasive species issues to use clear and consistent terminology. This can improve invasive species education and limit confusion that can be caused by jargon or misusing terms. So using clear terminology will help stakeholders adopt behaviors that can limit introduction of new invasive species or just limit the impacts of those already established. So the 3 agreed criteria for calling a species invasive are: the species must be non-native to the area that we're considering. It must have been introduced either on purpose or unintentionally. And it needs to cause harm environmentally, economically, or to humans. And now I'll introduce one of the most notorious invasive species, Caulerpa taxifolia. Caulerpa taxifolia is a marine species of green algae. It was originally collected in the wild in the 80s from the east coast of Australia and was then cultivated for use in aquariums at the Stuttgart Aquarium in Germany, and was then shared with aquariums throughout Europe, including the Oceanographic Museum at Monaco. This strain that they developed, which we now call the aquarium strain, was highly prized by saltwater aquarists because it was attractive and it grew quickly and it removed excess nutrients from the tank water and was extremely hardy. It was easy to just grab some and send it to the next aquarium. They did, however, find out that it grew so well that it quickly overwhelmed their aquariums. It's nearly impossible to remove from your aquarium because it gets into the rocks and the coral, and just leaving a little bit behind allows it to regrow. In 1984, a square yard patch of Caulerpa taxifolia was discovered growing on the seafloor underneath the Oceanographic Museum at Monaco in the Mediterranean. By 1989, just 5 years later, the patch had expanded to cover 5.5 acres. You can see in this video the native seagrass Posidonia that grows there with the bright green Caulerpa next to it. It's dense. He's just taking handfuls of it out into his bag. Caulerpa was being spread from that original site by fragmentation on anchors and fishing equipment. A very small piece can start a new infestation, and it can survive out of the water for days. It does not reproduce sexually, this aquarium strain, just by fragmentation. By 2001, it had spread to 6 Mediterranean countries, which you can see in the yellow there, and covered over 30,000 acres of seafloor. And there weren't really coordinated attempts made to stop it. It was the first time it had been seen in the wild. It crossed country boundaries. No one could even agree if it was a native that had, moved through from the Red Sea. And so they just debated, was it there naturally? Well, an aquarist at the aquarium at Monaco said he threw it out the window into the sea. So that was the first clue. And then molecular analyses showed that it was all the aquarium strain clone. Everything out there is a clone of what's in the aquariums and spread all over the Mediterranean. It was not the native strain from the tropics. And this map shows the distribution of the native strain in the subtropical and tropical waters. Those are the yellow dots. Then you can see the orange dots are places where it has invaded outside of its natural range, and it's the aquarium strain. The unusual characteristics of the aquarium strain are its extremely rapid growth and its development of dense monotypic meadows. You can see in that picture, it just goes on, one thing like ice plant. In 1 square meter of Caulerpa, they've sampled up to 8,000 fronds, and it grows over 1 inch a day in good conditions. It's able to colonize sand, mud, rock, vertical walls, horizontal. It just goes up and over everything. Other factors that helped it spread were its easy dispersal by people and currents. It readily grows in rough water. You can see my head there in the water bobbing around as the whitewash slams against the dive platform. And there were dense beds of Caulerpa right underneath that I was sweeping my fins around in. So it just gets beat all over the coastline there and spread. The strain's also tolerant of low light, and in the Mediterranean, it can grow to over 100 meters in depth. Researchers have found these dense beds of Caulerpa smothering the native sea life, reducing the complexity of the habitats. You can see in these pictures, sponges, gorgonians are all covered over by the Caulerpa. And a big area of concern was the loss of seagrass beds. Again, those are several species of seagrass. It's a highly productive habitat, provides refuge and nursery grounds for fish and invertebrates. And taxifolia was running up into those beds and just smothering them. All Caulerpas have a defense mechanism. They contain something called caulerpanine, which is toxic to nearly all grazers. In its native range, Caulerpa is controlled by a slug, which is adapted to the toxin. In fact, it incorporates the toxin into the tissues of its body as a chemical defense of its own. I will mention that I've seen small-scale trials where they introduce these slugs as a method of control, and they're really effective. But the scalability and the palatability to the public of further introductions, it just made that an option they didn't pursue, but it was effective. And then there was an economic impact. They had to close harbors to prevent the further spread. And they had to close commercial fishing in some areas because the gear they were dragging through the Caulerpa was spreading it to new areas. So the US recognized this threat, having heard about it in the Mediterranean, and they made the aquarium strain of Caulerpa taxifolia a banned species under the Federal Noxious Weed Act. So it's illegal to import it into the US and transport it between state lines. I do want to mention, since we're in the Mediterranean, that it was later invaded by a second species, Caulerpa racemosa. And that's a grape caulerpa, it's called. And in some places, I've seen in Croatia and Eastern Mediterranean, they consider it to be more invasive than taxifolia. It reproduces sexually and it has outcompeted taxifolia. And this species is also very commonly used in the aquarium trade here in California. Which brings us to the discovery of the aquarium strain of Caulerpa here in California at 2 locations. I'm showing them. Agua Hedionda is near San Diego, and Huntington Harbor is further north in Orange County between San Diego and Los Angeles. The aquarium strain of Caulerpa taxifolia was widely used in California aquariums, along with racemosa, prolifera, and others. It's primarily used in refugia tanks, which are secondary tanks often hidden from view, where plants are allowed to grow and uptake excess nutrients from the main aquarium. In the refugium, the rapid growth quickly leads from a starting point of this is the just a rock with Caulerpa on it, to this, a tank jam-packed with Caulerpa, which then needs to be pulled out and disposed of. So how did Caulerpa get to California? Well, there's no Caulerpa taxifolia naturally occurring anywhere near California. It doesn't attach to boat hulls. It's not carried in ballast water. And molecular analysis did end up showing that it was also a clone of the Mediterranean aquarium strain. It could have been the result of someone intentionally dumping an aquarium into the wild. People dump fish and aquarium stuff into the wild all the time, thinking that they're helping animals out. Or it could have been released through carelessness. You can see in these pictures, this is an aquarium. I think it was in Huntington Harbor, and this is a hose where they're bringing water up into the tank, and then they're discharging it back out into the harbor. The first of the 2 taxifolia discoveries was made in San Diego at Agua Hedionda Lagoon by a team of our divers that were surveying the eelgrass beds there. So this lagoon is connected to the ocean here. And in this basin, it provides cooling water to this power plant. At the time, it did. It supports an aquaculture facility here. There's a YMCA camp here. And then this is a large basin used by the public for boating. And the red dots are where the Caulerpa was. You can see in this picture how dense it was. The main patch of it was so big, you could see it from the air. In this picture, you can see this patch. We tried to put a float line around it because we thought that was all that was there. And then when we went up in a helicopter, we could see there's some here and there's some here. It was well outside of it. The dark area is all eelgrass, and the bright fluorescent green is the Caulerpa. The second location is in Huntington Harbor in Orange County, as I mentioned, and this is the opening to the ocean. And the Caulerpa was found way over here in these 2 ponds. They're man-made ponds. Water's pumped up here artificially, and then it drains back out into the harbor here. Taxifolia had been known to the homeowners and was just brought to light due to the publicity in San Diego. This Caulerpa was most certainly released intentionally. People were dumping aquariums while we were working there. There's a road you can pull up on, dump your aquarium, and move on. So what did the discoveries mean to California? Well, we had to rely on the stories we heard from the Mediterranean Sea. This book, Killer Algae, had just been translated into English and was on a lot of people's radar. We had the observed displacement of native habitat. We could see it. Where there used to be eelgrass, there was now Caulerpa. And then we could just make projections on its knowing its invasive tendencies, how easily it spread, and how close we were to the ocean. Immediately after the first discovery, quick action was taken. A multi-agency team was formed to develop a response. We called ourselves the Southern California Caulerpa Action Team, or SCAT. And the extent of the infestation was mapped by divers. We built a grid over what we thought was the full infestation and mapped it all out. And we explored different eradication methods. Also, we looked for money. We had to realign the uses of the lagoon. We had to allow the divers to work safely and minimize the chance of further spread. So the main infestation was right here in the area that was used by jet skis. It's likely that they did further distribute it over there. And so we moved the jet skis over here and the boats over here. The site was initially secured by wardens from the Department of Fish and Wildlife with support from the city's police harbor patrol. This is a picture of our work site from above. We're lucky that we had an area to work right on the shore of the infestation. We promptly began considering our options for eradication. We consulted with our European colleagues and they urged us to pursue eradication, not control, and to avoid manual removal because the difficulty of just leaving a tiny piece behind would erase any effort you made to just pull it out. So we began field testing with a series of study plots. We tried dredging with a small dredge. We tried just excluding light by covering it. We tried covering it with sand. We tried just hand picking it, and we tried various herbicides. I think we may have also tried putting salt on it. Based on our testing and speaking with other experts, we decided on a treatment approach that used a combination of a tarp and an herbicide. Over the patches of Caulerpa, we carefully placed heavy PVC barriers or tarps. We use those words interchangeably. We secured them with rebar and gravel bags, and then we fitted them with an access port that little arrow is pointing to. The diver could then open the port and connect to a hose from shore, which pumped liquid chlorine under the tarp. For smaller tarps, we applied solid chlorine pucks under the tarp. So although we found in our testing that just using the tarp would likely be effective, there was concern that the tarps could get dislodged as Caulerpa died and off-gassed, potentially releasing half-dead Caulerpa fragments into the lagoon. So we wanted to kill it quickly and then keep it contained and blocked from the light by the tarp. That's what it looks like under the tarp when we take a peek. So a rapid response and eradication program was developed. We got funding from the state, from the feds, from the locals. Also, we had private funding. Fortunately, this lagoon, because it was used by the power plant, was leased to the power plant. And so they provided funding immediately because it was in their best interest to keep the lagoon open and not have any constraints to drawing water in and pumping it back out to the ocean. We also engaged with the public and the local government immediately and ongoing throughout the whole project, which was really vital. We had public town hall meetings. I had a phone line set up where people could call up and get updates, especially updates on use of a lagoon so they could know where to go, where the divers were. We had signs posted at every access point at both of the infestation sites so that everyone knew what was going on. We had articles in newspapers that really helped to get buy-in from the public. And then we began full-scale survey and tarping at both locations. And roughly 2 years later, we had put about 3 or 4 acres of tarp at each of the sites. And in this image, you can see the chlorine supply line from shore going out to the main infestations. So the white areas are tarps that have sediment settled on them, and then the dark around is still the existing eelgrass that was not infested. A crucial element of the eradication program was the prompt, repeated, systematic resurvey for missed plants. We used a transect methodology to survey each of the lagoons. We would lay survey lines down and swim up and down the sides of the lines with a team of divers that were tied together. This schematic kind of shows we lay these big black, it's shown as a big black line. It was just this rope on the boat. We'd lay it down, but we knew exactly where it was laid because we used a DGPS. And then the divers would swim up one side and down the other. And then they would just switch to this line. And then Robert would roll up this line and leapfrog down and put the next one down. And so this is what it would look like after we mapped all the lines that we put down. They would just spend a couple months swimming all parts of the lagoon looking for Caulerpa. And when we would find it, we'd flag it, GPS it, and tarp it. This shows the whole lagoon. All the lines swum over each quarterly survey over 4 or 5 years. We covered every square meter of the bottom with a total of 500 diver miles swum. So how could we know when we were done that Caulerpa taxifolia had been eradicated? I think it's an important point to make that the term eradication means the entire population is verified to have been killed or removed. Sometimes this meaning is understandably not clear to everyone. And so it may seem like just because we don't see it anymore that it's eradicated, but we mean that we verified that it is gone at the particular site we were dealing with. So at that time, no marine seaweed, including taxifolia, had been eradicated from the wild. So we developed our criteria for eradication based on techniques used in terrestrial plant eradications, the known biology of Caulerpa, and then the tested limitations of our treatment approach and our survey techniques. So our criteria that we came up with were simply the containment and lethal treatment of Caulerpa at the site. Is it dead? And did we verify that it's absent? Is it gone for sure? So to figure out if Caulerpa is dead, well, we did quarterly follow-up surveys for 3 years, and we never found it growing there. Then we took cores from underneath the tarps that had been treated and grew them up in a laboratory, and no Caulerpa grew. Fortunately, we did see this is an eelgrass plant that sprouted up out of a seed that had been trapped under a tarp with chlorine for 2 or 3 years. And it just sat there waiting for good conditions, and then it sprouted again. So that was really nice to see. We also cut holes in the tarp and monitored them for 4 years. None of these holes sprouted Caulerpa again. So criterion 1 is met. Caulerpa is dead. The second criteria was knowing that all the Caulerpa out there had been found. To do that, fake Caulerpa in various sizes was deployed during all of our surveys. We had 1 fronders, 5 fronders, 10 fronders, big ones, big patches like this, 1/2 meter, a whole meter. And Robert would seed the whole survey area with these fake Caulerpas so that we could know what the smallest size was that we could find 100% of the time. Since we had been measuring the growth rate of Caulerpa, we could calculate how long would it take to grow to a size that we could find 100% of the time. In this example here, it was one of our surveys was way in the back of the lagoon. Visibility was terrible. The only thing our divers could find all the time was the 1 meter patch. But on another survey, when it was good conditions and the water was clear, sometimes the 10 frond was the patch we could find 100% of the time. So we could take the actual proportion found for each survey and calculate how many more surveys were needed to be certain we had found it all. So that number changed with each survey as the conditions made it easier or harder to survey. So that's why we couldn't ever know how long it was going to take, because it was constantly evolving. But in the end, we were able to calculate with certainty that we had found all the Caulerpa that was out there. At Agua Hedionda, we were 99.86% sure. And at Huntington Harbor, we were 99.99% sure. Both criteria were met in December 2005, and we declared it eradicated in 2006. The next step, of course, was to go back out and take up all the tarps. And that took a year or two, but we had to take all the plastic back up off the bottom so the eelgrass could grow back. I just want to briefly touch on our assessment of, is Caulerpa taxifolia really as bad as we feared? Because remember, the answer to this question was key, as we talked in the beginning, to labeling if something even is an invasive species. So concurrent with the eradication, we collected some data on the impact of Caulerpa. The most observable impact was to the eelgrass here at Agua Hedionda. This map shows eelgrass is in bright green and the Caulerpa patches are in red. And nearly everywhere that we mapped Caulerpa, there had been eelgrass previously. In this photo, you can see the eelgrass bed is just completely overgrown by dense Caulerpa. That's eelgrass in the background and Caulerpa in the front. Also, we collected blades of Caulerpa, eelgrass, and a mix of the two, and counted the number of epifaunal critters living on the blade. So animals living on the surface of either Zostra, that's the name of the eelgrass, and the Caulerpa, or a mix where it was being invaded by the two. And you can see over here, the Zostra had lots of animals growing on it. The mix had a little bit less, and Caulerpa meadow had hardly anything. Similarly, we examined cores of sediment taken from the eelgrass and Caulerpa beds. So looking at critters growing in the mud underneath the bed. And this is how much was living in just bare ground. This was in eelgrass. And this is way down in Caulerpa. It's greatly reduced the number of invertebrates living in the sediment. And of course, the mix was a in-between state. Few other elements of our response that I'll mention just because they're really important. We had an extensive outreach element. Over 7 years, we reached out to hobbyists, aquarium maintenance providers, harbor masters, online retailers, scuba divers, and we gave presentations. We made Post-its and beer koozies and flyers. And I just wanted to share my favorite poster, the Caulerpanator. I'll read you a few messages at the bottom because that was the messages we shared. Don't use Caulerpa in your refugium or aquarium. Properly dispose of your aquarium water and the contents of your aquarium. And never release aquarium water into the gutter, storm drain, or open body of water. It was also, of course, important to look at other places in Southern California. And every coastal embayment from Point Conception to San Diego, basically central to Southern California, we did a risk assessment and identified the highest risk areas in each lagoon and harbor and surveyed them all, and no Caulerpa was found. The state of California responded by banning the sale and possession of 9 species of Caulerpa. I'll note that Caulerpa prolifera was not included in the ban because we were only able to include things that were either known to be invasive or looked like taxifolia. I won't detail the sources, but the 7-year project cost between $7 and $8 million. So looking back on the taxifolia eradication, we've identified our key elements of success. Most important was the assumption that eradication was possible. We weren't looking at control or management. Eradication was the target. We had decisive leadership, particularly from the state and federal agencies on our team. We were able to get into the water immediately to assess the extent of the infestation and start testing response options. There was no hand-wringing, no debating. We just got in the water and started mapping. We consulted extensively with our European colleagues to get their input. And they felt that it was too late for the Mediterranean, but that we were in a good position to be successful. So they were very encouraging. We had dedicated, adequate, and flexible funds. We had an intensive long-term follow-up survey program. Our steady long-term surveys were critical to knowing that we hadn't missed anything, that if we had left something behind, it would have negated all the money and time we had spent. So the fact that we kept looking until we were sure, and that we quantitatively evaluated our methods, our treatment methods and our survey methods. And we engaged stakeholders. I think that was important. Everyone supported us and people were aware of what we were doing out there and hopefully stopped dumping their aquariums. And lastly, just our willingness to adapt and adjust as needed, because things change all the time. You learn things while you're out there, and our eradication plans have many amendments as we had new ideas and new things worked. I do want to mention that also in 2000, our colleagues in New South Wales, Australia, discovered the aquarium strain as well, growing near Sydney. Today, it's still there in 14 estuaries and also at one ocean site. They feel like they should focus their efforts on preventing spread, not trying to remove the established infestations. And they recognize that large outbreaks of Caulerpa are nearly impossible to eradicate. They're very expensive and they require endless resources. So they're focusing instead on outreach and prevention. There's also infestations in South Australia, and they've come to the similar conclusion as New South Wales, that it's infeasible to eradicate due to the size of the populations. And so they are focusing again on outreach and prevention. While we're in the Southern Hemisphere, I'll jump ahead just to share that New Zealand has unfortunately found several very large infestations of non-native Caulerpas. Thank you for sharing your photos with us. I'm sorry if my map isn't completely accurate. They sent us this image of a beach smothered in wrack of Caulerpa left behind by a cyclone, which they said they estimate was 50 tons of biomass on the beach. You can see in these photos that it's really blanketed their seafloor. Now I'm jumping forward to 2020 back in California. An unknown algae was found while they were recording a nature documentary in Newport Bay in Orange County. That's near to where Huntington Harbor is. They identified it the following spring as Caulerpa prolifera, a different Caulerpa that has a flat feathery blade, also used in our aquariums, but it is not banned in California or the US. This is a map just showing Newport Bay. It's right here that we found the Caulerpa, so you can see just how close it is to the entrance to the ocean. This is up close of, it's called China Cove, and that's where our infestation was. Our initial observations were that there were dense expanses where eelgrass used to be. There were fragments floating around loose in the current. The bottom right, you can see it's attached to some grassolaria just rolling around on the bottom. The upper right photo, that's a sea hare animal moving around in the Caulerpa. And there were patches scattered around the area as deep as 20 or 22 feet. So the response to prolifera in Newport Bay started with the reconvening of SCAT 10, 15 years later. Similar agencies represented, different people, and several concurrent actions were taken. We began planning meetings to determine what are the options. Should we try to tarp it again? How are we going to remove it? Dive teams went out right away and just started to assess it, get a general idea of how much was out there. And then a rapid response and eradication plan was drafted outlining our response approach. The treatment approach we chose was physical removal. Although placement of tarps would have been preferred, the slope of the site and the strong currents coming in from the mouth and shifting sands raised some concern that it would be difficult to hold the tarp in place for a long enough time to kill Caulerpa. Once we agreed on a plan, we did what we call an eradication level or 100% survey of China Cove. And this involves, like I described above, a boat precisely laying down a series of parallel lines like these yellow ones, and teams of divers, 4 to 6 divers lining up and swimming up one side and down the other, just like we did at the taxifolia sites. They hold a rope to maintain their spacing. And so this diagram kind of shows the lines that they swam at China Cove, and the dots show where we found Caulerpa in green and yellow there. And they found 48 patches covering about 1,000 square feet or 1,000 square meters. You can kind of see in the picture that what it looks like, just more flat, twisty blades. So after the survey, we got started on the removal. Divers used a suction dredge to remove the top 6 inches of sediment and algae, and then additional divers were nearby collecting any fragments broken free. The sucked up algae was pumped up to the beach to a primary filter box, and water from that box was decanted to a second box, filtered through a 1 millimeter mesh before letting the water return to the bay. And then this picture shows the Caulerpa and mud and eelgrass that was left behind, and that was transferred away for upland disposal. This removal was completed in 8 days. Time on the beach was about 2 weeks. Divers made several observations of concern. Between that mapping in June and the removal in July, they saw that many of the dense patches had become sparse. The prolifera had become fragmented, which was a worry due to the location of China Cove right there at the inlet of the bay. And the patches that they had marked in June had in many cases been buried by sand. You can see in the picture on the right, that yellow is a flag at the top of a 14-inch stake that was stuck into the sand. But when they came back, all that was left was the flag. The rest of the stake was underground, and the little green in the corner is a little bit of Caulerpa that peeked up out of the sand. So that's problematic because things being buried masked where it was. And then when currents wash the sand away, the exposed fragments can spread again in the current. And then the buried fragments, they just sprout a new stem or a new frond. It's just how Caulerpa, it's so plastic. It can shapeshift. If there's some frond left, it can grow a new stem. If there's stem left, it grows new fronds. And whatever is buried, it just shoots something back up out of the sand to keep growing. After that removal, we did weekly surveys, and we found additional small occurrences. We found some new patches further out, expanding our infestation area. And a lot of our finds did show evidence of them being previously buried in the sand and resprouting. And the remaining Caulerpa was very small and cryptically colored. So you can see on the left, that's what it looked like originally. On the right, the diver's pointing at a little teeny tiny piece in the eelgrass. It's the same color as eelgrass. It's really hard to find. So we talked about how being adaptable was key to success. So as the remaining Caulerpa became more and more difficult to find, we did have to modify our survey approach. And we built a grid over the infestation site. So it's kind of, you can see it's a letter and numbered grid put over where we knew Caulerpa was. The bright green is eelgrass that exists, and all the dots are the different finds of Caulerpa. So this grid allowed divers to be assigned a certain square in the grid, and they could go at their own pace to clear the grid section. So if it was really dense eelgrass, they could take their time and poke around. If they were out in a cell that didn't have eelgrass, water quality was good, they could see, they could move faster. This is a picture of the graph of our number of finds after the initial removal. We went out and we would just count how many patches. They were all small, so we just count how many patches we find. So initially we find 50 extra, 60 extra. Now we're down to finding 1 or 2. And based on our measured efficacy and the issues with fragmentation and burial, we are going to consider what we call phase 1, or the initial removal, complete after we've had 3 consecutive surveys with no Caulerpa found. We've only gotten to 1 survey. We keep hoping we're going to get to 2, and then we find some more again. We just did a survey and found 1 patch, so it kind of resets our clock. But after phase 1 is complete, we'll enter phase 2, which is the surveillance, like I described at Agua Hedionda. We're going to model after our successes with taxifolia, balancing the efficacy of our divers with the biology of the algae. So we expect it's going to take several years of quarterly surveys. Has prolifera spread from China Cove? We did surveillance offshore. You can see I'm showing you, this is China Cove. Right in this piece of coast here is some really valuable habitat. We have beautiful reefs. There's eelgrass in the inlet here. So we surveyed in there one time with divers and did not find any Caulerpa. However, Robert found Caulerpa growing right here. It's called Collins Island. It's about a mile from China Cove. And in this case, it was no current, flat ground. So he removed it manually and was able to put a tarp on top of it, because that is our preferred approach, and was able to knock out that little infestation right there. So just to summarize prolifera, we've spent almost $1 million to date. The initial removal is not complete, as I described, and we've got several years to go. We need to have an outreach program, because everything we taught people 20 years ago, they've forgotten. We have a whole new batch of people. The good news is there's a legislative ban for the entire genus of Caulerpa in California in progress. But the important lesson is, once the investment is started, you have to see it through, because if you leave anything behind, you run out of money, and that fragment you missed regrows. It just negates all the money and time that's been spent. So that's the end of my presentation. And my colleague Robert, as I said, is on the phone. He and I can answer any questions. I included this picture. I'd be curious if anyone in the group knows Caulerpa, if they've had it in their tank, if they've seen other people using it. The one in the front is taxifolia. It's a feather type Caulerpa, and the one in the back, kind of faint, that's grape Caulerpa. That's the racemosa. And those are both banned in California, but they're widely used in refugia, as I described.
Again, if people have comments related to their aquariums at their homes or offices, if you could answer a question that Rachel just asked in the chat, that's very helpful information to know. And then my associate Julie Clark with UC Cooperative Extension has been monitoring both the chat and the questions. And Julie, are there questions that have been asked that we can give Rachel?
There are. First one from Miranda.
So the question is, what experience do you have in eradicating or actively controlling exotic Caulerpa from different substrates?
Mooney?
That's a good question. It was, when the folks came out from the Mediterranean early on, they portrayed a scenario to us, as Rachel can attest to, having dove over there, that it was growing on everything. Hard rock as well as soft bottom. All of our experience was soft bottom lagoon habitats, and luckily we were able to get on top of it before it spread and got onto our rocky reefs. We did, however, subsequent to the eradication effort, Merkel and Associates received some funding, and we went out and did some trial efforts in different habitats offshore. So we went out to areas off of Point Loma and basically practiced, so that if we ever had something come up again, we would know whether or not we could be effective on a rock soft substrate, for instance. And to some degree it was doable. It's obviously a much more challenging environment to work in the surge. And in that scenario too, we weren't actually killing anything, so we didn't have to worry about the off-gassing and so forth that would come with the decay. And that was an issue that Rachel mentioned that we were really worried about in Newport, that as it decays, it causes the barriers to billow up and they can break open from the off-gassing, and then you might have a release that way. And different programs, freshwater lakes and stuff, they use some perforated barriers for that purpose. So there are different ways of getting around that issue for sure. But fortunately, we did not have to deal with anything other than a relatively soft, flat bottom.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Danielle. And did you encounter any sensitive species around the treatment areas? And if so, how did you handle the situations or anticipate them?
Well, I'm thinking, I don't know that we had any sensitive species really close to us that were a concern, but we did kill everything under the tarp. And that was considered, I mean, I guess eelgrass is a sensitive species, but we considered that it was all going to die anyway. When Caulerpa took over, and as you could see from our charts, the eelgrass is gone, the benthic inverts are gone, the epifauna is gone. We felt like that was a worthwhile sacrifice to lose everything under the tarp. That was a concern, though. We did talk about that a lot beforehand, but as I mentioned, we were glad to see that the eelgrass resprouted. And when you fly over Agua Hedionda now, you can see that the eelgrass has grown back into those patches that we freed up.
I'd like to add it's a critical point about putting together the action team with multiple agencies involved, because yes, as Rachel mentioned, eelgrass is sensitive in that it's an important habitat forming species, and so it's highly managed, right? And so we needed the buy-in from regulatory agencies to make sure it was okay to have at least a temporary impact on that resource. And we go through the same thing right now with the work that we're doing in Newport Beach, where agencies such as the California Coastal Commission have been involved in NOAA Fisheries and have basically, helped us to be able to waive some of those impacts involved with the seagrass.
Thank you. Elise asks a few questions about the infestation located in Agua Hedionda, and wants to know how large is that reserve, what percentage of it was covered in Caulerpa, and if you have any economic costs of the eradication efforts there.
How many acres is the East Basin, Robert?
I can never remember the answer to that.
I think you probably saw the slide that I put up that had the red dots, so you could get a feeling for where it was distributed.
I think it's around 120 acres, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And yeah, and so we were dealing with something on the order of, overall it added up to, I want to say it was 1,000 square meters. Is that what you had presented?
Well, I remember we had 4.5 acres of tarp. So that kind of gives some perspective, 4.5 compared to the 120 acres of the East Basin there.
Right. And then the Caulerpa that was covered was a smaller subset of that, because we always went in with a buffer approach where we covered more than was, we didn't cover just to the boundary, because you could have some small fragments nearby, something that was about to pop up. So we would always go larger than we thought we needed in order to get a hold of it.
Right.
And can you share costs?
Right, it was $7 million for both sites, and the majority of that was at Agua Hedionda, though we did have the surveillance up and down the coast and the outreach as well. I can see, just scanning through these, I know we're short on time, that it was disposed of. Someone asked, what did you do with it? We took it to the dump, right? Is that where it went, Robert?
In the prolifera instance, yeah, right, because with taxifolia earlier on, it was smothered, it was all decayed and gone by the time the barriers came out. With prolifera in Newport Beach, the material that went into those dewatering boxes was taken to a city yard where they store their equipment and so forth, and was allowed to dry out at an upland facility. And then it was taken for landfill after it had dried out.
Right. Someone asked about the divers. We didn't have scientific divers, but we are divers at our biological firm. So some people are scientific divers, but we had a mix of just people who wanted to come out and dive. We would train them. Others were divers at our company, so they were more biologically trained. But yes, that was the greatest cost. It costs a lot of money to have a team of 6 or 7 divers out there. But we weren't paying commercial diving rates, scientific diving rates. It was just a biological technician type rate. And the site's still monitored. Now, once you declare eradication, you don't go back and monitor unless you're looking for a new infestation. So we could go back out and look, but sort of in our mind, you stop looking. When you declare it, it's because you said you were sure. And so you don't go back and look. Of course, Robert and I keep an eye on it from above and we drive by.
You know, I think we did go out a year or two later for a quick scan of the site. So we cheated a little bit. I'll mention too, Keith Merkel is who was instrumental in all this, and I worked for at the time, and Rachel still does. And he had texted me along the lines of what we had mentioned with the offshore work that was done and trying to cover over reefs and stuff. We did develop kind of a protocol document at that time that could be looked into to look at, you know, what our successes were and how we went about putting barriers on rocky reefs.
We have not done an economic assessment for the cost if we had not done anything, but we'd all like to have that. Caulerpa brachypus. We do not have Caulerpa brachypus. It's one of the banned species in California, but we only have prolifera, and then we had taxifolia, but have not had it since. And yes, eelgrass has come back in areas that we killed Caulerpa. Do you have a log of total hours diving? Well, we dived nonstop every day for 4 or 5 years with about 5 to 8 divers, 3 people on the boat. I think each survey cost us about $10,000. No, it was like $4,000 a day, right?
Right. Yeah. Back in the early 2000s. Right. So when we were doing taxifolia, the work frame was roughly, you know, June of 2000 to the end of 2005. And yeah, we were going through at that time about $5,000 a day. And as Rachel showed all those lines on the map, how large that just at Agua Hedionda, it basically took us nearly a quarter. So 3 months to cover that entire lagoon one time. And I think by the end of it, we had 12 negative surveys to get to that 99% criteria, right? So it had been 3 years of just back-to-back surveys in order to get to that point after we had, you know, treated the final patch of Caulerpa.
Okay, we can try to answer some of the remaining questions, but we should just acknowledge that we're grateful for everybody for being on today's call. We have a survey to collect feedback, what you thought of the call. So that link is in the chat. If people can complete the survey, we would greatly appreciate it. If you need to get off now, that's fine. I think Rachel and Robert are happy to answer a few more questions for those that want to stay on.
When divers came in from the dive, how did we ensure Caulerpa was not carried on shore? Well, we told them to check their fins. I think everyone was, especially early on, everyone was extremely aware that that was a possibility, that we needed to not spread it around. All the divers we had in the first year were from our company, very experienced, very self-aware of their gear. And we didn't let things dangle, have our extra gauges and extra respirators. All that stuff was either gone or tucked away. So we didn't drag anything on the bottom. And then in all the follow-up surveys, it would be just finding one little patch over there. We'd put a flag in it. But you're right, we all had to be aware also of not dragging our feet on the bottom just to not stir it up. So we always had really good technically savvy divers, because yeah, if we had someone just drop down and they were lost and their weight belt was a mess and they couldn't compensate, that didn't work out. We had to have people that had good control of their body.
Yeah, a point came up earlier that I wanted to address too when we were talking about scientific divers and so forth. One of the results of this work, the early work in the early 2000s and after declaring eradication, was that NOAA Fisheries and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife developed the Caulerpa Control Protocol. And one of the components of that now is that you have to pass an exam in order to be a Caulerpa certified diver in California. So that might not speak to necessarily your qualifications as a diver to perform our surveys or do the work. We want to make sure you have good buoyancy control and all of that. But there is a procedure to train and test in order to be able to do Caulerpa surveillance.
Right, good point.
Rachel and Robert, there are a couple of questions that ended up in chat, if I can relay them to you. One is, did you consider using biodegradable tarps such as wool or fibrous material? And there's some backup questions to that from the same person.
Actually, I'll let Rachel say whether we did consider that or not, but I can speak to, we do, my company, we do some freshwater work as well. And that has been tried in some of the freshwater environments using biodegradable materials. One of them's it's a woven mesh of fibers from aspen, if I recall correctly. And one of the problems that we've observed with that, with this Curlex material, is that it starts to break up, and in any sort of current, it starts rolling around on the bottom. And so in the case of the Caulerpa fragments, I would be concerned that we could see some of that same, right? You're introducing some material that might then move around. So there's certainly room for those types of approaches. And I think there would need to just be a little bit more R&D into any given circumstances to what its longevity would be, because you certainly want to make sure that it lasts longer than the amount of time it takes to impact the Caulerpa and kill the Caulerpa.
Rachel, you have anything to add to that, or
No, that's good.
Okay, and then the same person asks, at what threshold of water movement do tarps stop being effective because of difficulties pinning them to the seafloor?
That's a tough question that we don't have the actual data on, but somebody in the chat did ask for the report from where we did the high energy environment work, and it's just been so long since we did that. Doc would be interested to go back and review that before having a discussion about doing high energy work. It basically comes down to, if you could hold it down and keep it there, it will be effective, right? And then you'd have to consider it in the context of the extent of your problem and what your goals are, right? In our case, where we're shooting for that eradication, we're trying to balance the potential for releasing fragments, which could do some additional harm to the eradication program. If we were in a really terrible situation and we were, just doing control or trying to reduce the footprint to, say, protect a marine protected area or something like that, then there might be an acceptable amount of loss and a willingness to take greater risk, right, with things such as that.
Right. There was also a question about how long the tarp had to be left down. Sorry, blurry. I think it should stay down for a long time, but Robert left it down for just a month and it was fine. He pulled up the tarp and the Caulerpa hasn't come back, but I would say it'd be smart to leave it down for 6 months or a year, just to be sure, depending on how much you had. He removed the Caulerpa before he put the tarp down.
Right. So in that instance, this was the one that's recent on Caulerpa prolifera, where we had something on the order of something that was just a little bit larger than a square meter, and it was a satellite patch that was a mile away from everything else. And we're still hopeful that there's nothing in between. But yeah, we removed it first. And so if we were really effective at removing it, then we wouldn't have seen growth. We put the barrier down as a double, to kind of double down on it. And then we removed it and monitored because we kind of wanted to know, what might the minimum look like under this type of scenario where we have to be dynamic and get in, treat something and get out again. Rachel and I, we did the work that Rachel showed where we cut open the barriers for taxifolia. She might remember, but we started cutting those open to also get at those data. And again, it's been almost 20 years now, so I don't remember how long the answer was and when we started cutting them open. It might have been a year after or something like that. And then, and we didn't have any regrowth.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because it was 4 years that we had them open. So yeah, it must have been a year into it. I see a few questions about the grid and how we built it. We built the first one with PVC stakes and mason twine, and we just lettered and numbered it. We lettered all the poles. I think they were like 5 meters on a side. And then Robert built the new grid up in Newport. How'd you build that?
Same sort of thing with rebar stakes in the bottom with ropes stretched across it. In that instance, at Agua Hedionda for taxifolia, we really did have the benefit of police involvement and so forth, buoying off the area and keeping the public out of it. And our grid lasted. In Newport Harbor, we have not been able to do that. And so we're finding anchors get dragged through our grid and it gets torn up. And so it's actually currently in a total state of disrepair. And the last time we went out to survey, we basically had to lay new lines using fiberglass tape measures as a quick remedy. I mean, we had all the spots waypointed, so we could, redeploy tape measures on the scale of that grid very quickly and kind of keep the survey going. So you really got to think about who the users are, how remote the area is, because things like that are easy to snag with anchors.
And the one in the eelgrass bed, the whole thing was raised up off the bottom. We made real long poles. We were in I don't know, 8 to 15 feet of water. And we had long poles and the rope was halfway up the pole. So it would be above the eelgrass, and we used bright colors so you could see it. I think the one at Newport is on the bottom, right?
Yeah, it's pretty much on the bottom, and we do get a lot of shifting sand, and so that can obscure it. Although once a diver can find a line, they can kind of lift that up so that they can follow it. If you were in a thick Caulerpa bed, you would have to be concerned about that. We didn't put the grid down until we had virtually no Caulerpa, and we were just trying to very systematically survey our core area. And look, I'm sure some of you looking at the figures that Rachel showed would quickly see just how close we still have Caulerpa or had Caulerpa to the perimeter of our grid. And we are not blind to the fact that we need to look beyond that grid. It's just resources and time. And we occasionally look beyond the grid with the diver transect methods. But we just are really focused right now on finishing up in this core area and then hoping that we could continue to survey and not find any additional.
There were some questions in the chat related to aquarium suppliers and pet stores about their awareness of this issue, maybe related to alternatives to Caulerpa in terms of aquatic plants. Are there things that we know are not invasive? Are there any best practices regarding aquarium maintenance?
Yes, to all of that. All aquarium stores know that it's illegal to have it. It's worth doing a new round of outreach to aquarium hobbyists because it's widely available on the internet now. You can buy all of them from anywhere. So I think we would need to just redo the outreach that we did previously, where if you ordered Caulerpa on a website, there'd be a pop-up ad that would explain to you that it was illegal in California. We have a clear list of best practices for aquarists, and we have letters and flyers that got mailed out. Department of Fish and Wildlife visited all the aquarium stores, and we did recommend a few alternatives. And I think a lot of people have gotten away from it, partly because it just grows so crazy that they don't want something that aggressive. And I see it says, do aquarium dumping sites still exist? People still dump aquariums all the time. There's a lagoon by our house. I know people drive up and dump aquariums into them, which is why I think new outreach, would be great to have. Oh, you're muted.
No, sorry, I just said I'm doing a survey. An employee just poked in to ask a question.
Robert, I see a lot of questions about how we decide what's the cutoff between tarping and vacuum. How steep is too steep?
Yeah, we just really had to go with our gut on that, and it was the combination of having a bit of a slope there, a lot of seagrass, and a surge environment. So the idea there too with the seagrass is, when you cover it, that's going to be more material that's off-gassing, right? The more you kill, the more gas you're going to create. And then as those barriers start to bubble up and you've got the surge, you could potentially have seams open up, right? So, is there a magic formula? No. We were concerned about the containment. What I would say is, I think a bit of a lesson learned for us on the current effort is, I think I would have gone ahead, looking back, and tried to do more barrier placement following the removal, because we're now at a stage where, yes, we've gotten rid of all the material. Our divers go back through the site, and one survey we find 0, and the next survey we find 1, and literally the last 4 surveys have been something like 2 zeros, a 1, and a 3 in terms of finding very small patches of Caulerpa. But a year ago it was, a 0 and then a 30, right? And then we would knock it back down again. And there was certainly in retrospect, there was probably a point in time when the lines crossed and it made sense to spend the investment to go ahead and put the barriers down, because you were at a point where you got rid of all the visible material. You had to worry about stuff sprouting back up, and the barriers would have just potentially finished it off, right? But the data were messy, right? The data were messy, and so we had to consider, we're almost there. We've almost got it. It doesn't make sense to invest all the money it would take to put the barriers down. And that's where we feel we truly are at now, right? It's just in retrospect, possibly, a few months into the effort, placing barriers might have been a good additional approach, right? So consider it that way. Like, it might not always make sense to put them in up front, but it might make sense to put them in as part of an overall strategy. And you've got to look at each kind of scenario and environment and do your best to make those judgment calls.
I see a question about toxins in Caulerpa, and is only Caulerpa taxifolia toxic? Are other species toxic? And all the species contain caulerpanine, which is toxic to a lot of grazers. There are some fish species that can eat Caulerpa. It doesn't bother them, but it's not toxic to humans, and it's really not a factor in our concern about Caulerpa. As far as it's the fact that it messes up the habitat. The fact that it's toxic just is relevant in that there's not a lot of natural animals that can graze on it, and certainly not in areas where it hasn't evolved naturally, so that there would be. herbivores that could eat it. So yes, they're all toxic. They're only toxic to marine life. And it's kind of a side concern about Caulerpa.
We have answered most of the questions. So thank you, Robert. Thank you, Rachel. This is a spectacular start to the Invasive Species Lunchtime Talks. And I hope people will be able to join us for the talks in the remainder of the week.